My brother smiled as the demolition crew arrived at our mother's lake house. "By sunset," he said, "this old place will be gone." He had no idea our mother had spent 9 years making sure he never had the legal right to say that. I looked past him at the porch where she used to drink her coffee every morning, wrapped in the same green cardigan, watching the water turn from black to silver. Then I looked back at him. "You bought the cabin," I said quietly, "but you never bought the right to destroy it." His smile didn't move yet. It would in about 6 weeks. I just hadn't told him that part. Welcome to Silent Mirror Stories, where silence hides the deepest truths and every reflection reveals a story no one expected. My name is Emma Lawson. I'm 38 years old. I'm an environmental attorney based in Traverse City, Michigan, and 3 months ago, I would have told you that losing my mother was the hardest thing I had ever survived. I was wrong. I say that not for drama, but because I want you to understand, from the very first minute of this story, that grief and betrayal are not the same wound, even when they arrive from the same direction. I had already survived the first one. I did not know the second one was coming from my own brother, and I did not know that the person who'd end up saving me from it had already been dead for 6 weeks by the time I needed her most. My mother, Carol Lawson, raised my brother Jason and me alone on the shore of Birch Lake after our father died of a heart attack when I was 6. She worked 2 jobs, days at the county clerk's office, evenings doing books for half the small businesses in town, and on that income, she kept our family cabin standing. Her own parents had built it in 1954, log by log, on 11 acres of shoreline that had belonged to our family for 3 generations. She was not a soft woman, exactly, though she loved fiercely. She had a particular way of handling anything that worried her. She'd go quiet, think it through fully on her own, and only act once she'd already decided precisely what she was going to do about it. I inherited that habit, for better or worse, and spent most of my adult life assuming it made me more like her than my brother was. I didn't yet understand how far she'd taken that same instinct with something as large as the fate of her own land. That cabin had a wraparound porch with a floor that creaked in the same 3 places no matter how many times my grandfather tried to fix it. A stone fireplace big enough to stand inside, and a dock he'd carved by hand out of cedar, plank by plank, over one long summer. My mother used to say that dock had absorbed more prayers and more forgiveness than most churches ever would. I remember being 8 years old, sitting on the end of that dock at 5 in the morning with her, both of us wrapped in the same wool blanket, fishing lines in the water, saying almost nothing for an hour. She wasn't a woman who filled silence just to fill it. She let things sit. I think that's where I learned to do the same. I remember the 4th of July bonfires, the whole lake gathered on our shoreline, sparklers from a coffee can she kept in the pantry all year. I remember the winter I was 12 and Jason was 14, when a storm knocked a birch tree across the dock, and she made us clear it ourselves rather than call anyone, because a family that can't fix its own dock has no business calling it theirs. Jason complained the whole afternoon. I loved every freezing minute of it. I remember, too, a smaller thing that mattered more than it seemed to at the time. My mother kept a coffee can of nails and a jar of loose screws on the porch railing, and every summer, without fail, she'd walk the whole dock barefoot, checking each board with her hand before she'd let either of us swim off the end of it. "You take care of a thing before it takes care of you," she used to say. Jason used to roll his eyes at that, too. I never did. I think, looking back, that was the difference between us in miniature. One small habit, repeated every June for 30 years, that told you everything about how she saw the world and everything about which of us was actually listening. My brother is 2 years older than me. We grew up in the same house, on the same lake, and came out completely different people. I stayed close, Michigan State, then law school at U of M, then a career close enough to visit her every few weeks. Jason left for Chicago at 22 and drifted into commercial real estate, then private investment, then a string of ventures that always sounded more impressive from the outside than they apparently were from the inside. He had a gift for talking about money in a way that made you believe he understood something the rest of us didn't, and for most of his 20s and 30s, I believed it too. He always wanted the cabin sold. "That place is a money pit, Em. he told me more than once at Thanksgiving, usually once our mother had gone up to bed. Taxes, insurance, upkeep, and for what? So we can drive up twice a year and play pioneer family. My mother never sold. Every time he brought it up, she'd go quiet in a particular way and say the same 6 words, the ones I'd hear again much later, framed above a fireplace. Some places are worth more than money. He'd roll his eyes every single time. I never once imagined that quiet, repeated disagreement would end up decided by a county judge. I found a whole shelf of her journals in a hall closet after the funeral, decades of spiral notebooks, mostly grocery lists and roof repair costs, but scattered through them were lines that read like she was talking directly to whichever of us eventually found them. One, dated 9 years back, stopped me cold the first time I read it at her kitchen table, coffee going cold beside me. Told the boys again today the lake isn't for selling. Jason didn't hear it. Emma did. I didn't understand, that first morning, how literally true that sentence would turn out to be. My mother died in April, at 71, from a stroke fast enough that she didn't suffer long. The funeral was small and full anyway, the way small towns always fill a room. Jason gave a eulogy that made people cry. He was always good at knowing exactly what a room needed to hear. 6 weeks later, he called me on a Tuesday evening while I was still at my office in Traverse City, finishing paperwork on an unrelated case. "I've got some good news," he said. "I found a buyer for the cabin, a development group out of Detroit, boutique resort, 12 cottages, a lodge, private marina, $4.2 million for the whole 11 acres. "I never agreed to sell," I said. "You don't need to. I'm executor of Mom's estate. I have authority to sell estate property. Papers are signed. It's already moving forward. I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it around town." "Jason." I kept my voice level, the way I do in depositions when a witness is about to say something they'll regret. "What papers?" "The sale agreement. It's done. Closing's in 6 weeks." I hung up and drove 3 hours north that same night, and I remember very little of that drive, except the feeling that something underneath my own life had quietly shifted while I wasn't paying attention. Then the paperwork. The cabin was dark and quiet when I let myself in with the spare key under the fake rock by the porch steps, same as always. I sat at her kitchen table until sunrise, reading every page of the estate documents Jason had emailed me, twice. A purchase agreement, signed by Jason as executor, transferring the property to a company called North Shore Cottage Holdings, LLC. Then the shell company. I ran that name through the state business database that night. North Shore Cottage Holdings had been formed 4 months earlier, before our mother even died, and Jason was its sole registered agent. A second document showed North Shore immediately reselling the property to the real buyer, Great Lakes Premier Resorts, for the full $4.2 million. My brother hadn't sold our mother's cabin to a developer. He'd sold it to himself first, through a company built for exactly this purpose, then flipped it, and the profit never appeared anywhere in the official estate filing. Then the number. The probate filing valued the cabin at $890,000, a 3-year-old tax assessment, conveniently outdated, conveniently low. Nobody but Jason knew the real number was nearly 5 times that. Then the neighbor. Walking the shoreline the next morning, I ran into Ruth Hendricks, 3 cabins down, who'd known my mother longer than almost anyone left in town. "I saw survey stakes go up along your mother's tree line 2 weeks ago," she told me, squinting out at the water. "Orange flags, the kind a developer uses before they file for permits. Asked your brother about it at the gas station. He said it was just paperwork. Didn't sit right with me. Your mother would have mentioned something like that to somebody before it got that far along. That told me the sale wasn't just signed on paper. It was already moving on the ground, weeks before Jason bothered to call me, and it told me he was moving fast enough to be finished before anyone in the family had time to ask the right questions. Then the receipts. Going through a drawer in the cabin's small home office, I found a folder of receipts Jason had apparently forgotten was there. Invoices from a surveying firm and an architectural consultant, both dated nearly 2 months before our mother's funeral. He hadn't waited for her to die to start planning this. He'd started while she was still alive, still drinking her coffee on that porch every morning, with no idea what her son was already quietly arranging behind her back. Then the old photo. Tucked inside one of her journals, I found a photograph I'd never seen. My mother and Walter Pierce standing together on the dock, both of them younger, both of them smiling at whoever was holding the camera, dated in her handwriting on the back to the same summer Walter later confirmed the trust was drafted. It was such a small, ordinary thing, two old friends on a dock, and yet once I understood what it actually documented, I couldn't stop staring at it. She'd been building this protection in plain sight the entire time, and none of us had ever thought to ask what that photo was doing in a drawer full of grocery lists. Then the email. I found one more thread, buried in an old laptop of hers I'd kept charged out of sentiment more than practicality, between my mother and Walter's paralegal, dated 10 months before her death, subject line simply, the file we discussed. The body was 3 sentences long. Please confirm everything is still current. I want it ready if it's ever needed. No need to involve the children yet. Reading my own name in that sentence, knowing she'd written it fully expecting I might never see it until it mattered, was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like a legal case and started feeling like a message she'd left for me on purpose. Then the attorney. I called Walter Pierce, my mother's lawyer of 30 years, the next morning. "Emma," he said, and something careful entered his voice the moment I said Jason's name. "I think you need to come in. There's something your mother asked me to hold on to that I was told not to discuss until it became necessary." Then the voicemail. Going through her answering machine that same week, I found a message Jason apparently never knew she'd kept, a private lender, calling her house directly, looking for him, 2 months before she died. My mother had known, or at least suspected, that her son was in serious trouble. She never said a word to me about it. Then the confrontation. I called Jason. "That trust doesn't override an executor's authority," he said, though I could hear him doubting the sentence even as he said it. "It's not an estate asset, Jason," I told him. "It hasn't been for 9 years. You sold something you never had the right to sell." The silence on the line told me everything the paperwork hadn't yet. It came out over the following 2 weeks. Jason's Chicago investment firm had collapsed 18 months earlier on bad real estate bets. He owed nearly $3 million to investors running out of patience, plus a smaller, more dangerous debt to a private lender. "You could have told me," I said to him, on a call in early June, once enough of it had surfaced that pretending any further felt pointless even for Jason. "Any of it. I would have helped you figure something out that didn't involve lying to Mom's estate." "You don't understand what it's like," he said, and for a moment his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. "Every month it got worse, and every month I told myself the next deal would fix it, and then Mom died, and suddenly there was this asset just sitting there worth more than everything else I had left combined. I told myself I wasn't stealing from you. I told myself I was borrowing against something that would have been split between us anyway. It was never going to be split between us, Jason. That's the part you still don't understand. It was never going to be sold at all." She never told me that. Not once, not directly. She just kept saying that same line about places being worth more than money, like that was supposed to mean something legal. "Maybe it wasn't supposed to be legal," I said. "Maybe it was supposed to be enough on its own, and you just never let it be." He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he'd ever once considered, in all his years of resenting that cabin, that our mother might simply refuse to let either of us decide its fate through ordinary inheritance, that she might have loved that shoreline enough to take the decision out of both our hands entirely, rather than trust either version of us to make it for the right reasons. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he'd ever once considered, in all his years of resenting that cabin, that our mother might simply refuse to let either of us decide its fate through ordinary inheritance. I sat across from Walter Pierce 2 days later in his office above the hardware store, the same office where he'd handled our mother's will after our father died, the same worn leather chairs, the same smell of old paper and pipe tobacco he'd apparently never smoked, but somehow always carried. And he slid across the desk a document I had never seen in my life. A conservation trust, established 9 years earlier. placing the cabin and all 11 acres into an irrevocable structure specifically designed to keep it out of any future commercial sale. "She came to me not long after your father's 10-year memorial," Walter said. "Watched 3 other cabins on this lake bulldozed for luxury builds inside a decade. Didn't want the same thing happening to yours the moment she wasn't around to stop it." I sat there turning the pages slowly, my legal training fighting against my grief to understand exactly what I was looking at, feeling the shape of the story shift underneath me the way a courtroom sometimes shifts when a witness says one sentence you weren't expecting. Oh, now everything was about to change. 8, bigger twist, 21/00/24/30. The trust named a single trustee with sole authority over any sale, transfer, or demolition of the property, not the executor of her general estate. The cabin had been carved out of the estate entirely 9 years earlier, meaning it was never Jason's to sell in the first place. No matter what the probate filing said, no matter how many signatures he'd collected, no matter how confidently he'd shaken a developer's hand across a closing table. The trustee was me. "Why didn't she just tell us?" I asked, once I trusted my voice again. "Why go through all of this quietly instead of just sitting Jason and me down and explaining it?" Walter took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk, the way he used to when I was a teenager, and he wanted me to actually hear something instead of just listen to it. "Your mother spent her whole life avoiding conflict where she could manage it," he said. "She told me once that if she confronted Jason directly about his spending, about the pressure he was under, he'd either lie to her face or shut her out entirely, and either way she'd lose whatever relationship she still had left with him. So she did what she always did instead. She quietly made sure the outcome couldn't be argued with and hoped she'd never actually need to use it." "But she knew," I said. "Toward the end, she knew he was in trouble." "I believe she suspected more than she let on," Walter said. He slid one more page across the desk, a codicil dated 8 months before she died, reaffirming the trust and requiring any decision be made entirely independent of the estate. The ink was still dark, recent, deliberate, nothing like the faded pages beneath it. She didn't explain why she wanted it strengthened. I didn't ask. That wasn't how she and I worked in 30 years. But I believe, by the end, she knew exactly what was coming. She just never found a way to say it to either of you directly. I sat in that office a long time before I could speak again, holding 9 years of my mother's quiet, patient protection of something none of us had known needed protecting. 9. Court/confrontation 24/30/31/00. Great Lakes Premier Resorts had already spent close to $2 million, engineering surveys, architectural plans, pre-sales marketing for the 12 cottages, a non-refundable deposit paid straight to Jason's shell company. Their construction crew showing up that first morning with a demolition permit wasn't a bluff. They genuinely believed, in good faith, that they owned clear title to build. Walter and I filed an emergency motion with the county probate court that same week, along with formal notice to Great Lakes Premier's legal counsel that the sale was void from its inception, since the seller had never held authority over trust property to begin with. Their attorneys pushed back hard, and I understood why $2 million of sunk cost has a way of making people believe very firmly in whatever story lets them keep their investment. Their lead attorney called me directly before the hearing, hoping to negotiate some kind of partial easement that would let a scaled-down version of the resort proceed alongside the preserve, 6 cottages instead of 12. He offered, then 8, his voice getting more urgent with each counteroffer I quietly declined. I told him, as gently as I could manage, that the trust document didn't allow for partial measures, and that even if it had, I wasn't going to be the one to undo what my mother had spent 9 years quietly protecting. I didn't entirely disagree with his underlying instinct, for what it's worth. I'm an environmental attorney, not a vindictive one, and I understood the developer had been genuinely misled, by my brother, not by me. But good faith doesn't create legal authority where none existed. You cannot buy something that was never for sale, no matter how many surveys you commission or how confidently the seller shakes your hand across a closing table. The hearing was held in the same county courthouse my mother had walked past every workday for over 20 years, a squat brick building on Main Street with a clock tower that had run 4 minutes slow for as long as I could remember. Jason sat 2 tables away with a Chicago attorney who looked considerably less confident than the man who told me the sale was already moving forward. He'd lost weight since the funeral. His suit sat loose at the shoulders, and for just a moment before the hearing started, I felt something that surprised me, not satisfaction, but a tired kind of grief for the brother I used to fish off that dock with, who somewhere along the way had convinced himself that money was the only inheritance worth fighting for. Ruth Hendricks sat in the back row in her church coat. A reporter from the regional paper sat 2 rows behind her, having caught wind of a family lake house dispute freezing a multi-million-dollar resort deal. Walter's 30-year folder of my mother's legal history sat between us like a patient witness finally allowed to speak. Walter presented the trust first, notarized, filed with the county recorder 9 years earlier, nomming me sole trustee. Judge Diane Osei, a woman I'd argued in front of twice before on unrelated land use cases, read it carefully. Then asked Jason's attorney one question that ended the matter in under 2 minutes. Was your client aware, at the time of this sale agreement, that the property was held in an irrevocable trust separate from the general estate? His attorney hesitated. My client believed, in good faith, that his role as executor extended to. That's not what I asked, Judge Osei said. I asked whether he was aware of the trust's existence. There was a long pause. Then Jason answered it himself directly, without waiting for his attorney to finish maneuvering around it. I found out after Emma did, he said. Before, I only knew Mom had set something up years ago. I didn't know what it meant until it was already too late to undo what I'd started. It was the first, fully honest thing my brother had said since our mother died. Judge Osei ruled from the bench 20 minutes later. The sale to North Shore Cottage Holdings, void from inception. The resale to Great Lakes Premier, void as well, though the court preserved the developer's right to pursue Jason personally for their losses. The cabin and all 11 acres reverted, cleanly and permanently, to the trust, under my authority, exactly as my mother arranged 9 years before any of us knew to expect it. I remember sitting there afterward, the courtroom emptying out around me, Walter quietly gathering his papers beside me, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at all, not triumph exactly, but a strange, settled relief, like finally putting down something heavy I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since the moment Jason first called me with his good news. Great Lakes Premier sued Jason within the month for the nearly $2 million they'd already spent, plus the deposit he'd already funneled toward his creditors and could not return. Their attorney told the local paper, in a quote that made its way around town faster than anything since the hearing itself, that his client had been the victim of a seller who misrepresented his own authority from the very first handshake. His remaining creditors, watching another source of repayment evaporate in a very public county ruling, stopped extending him any patience at all. By late summer, he'd filed for personal bankruptcy, lost his Chicago apartment, and settled what remained with a payment plan Walter said would likely follow him for a decade. Word got around Birch like the way it always does, thoroughly, not maliciously, and I know it cost him something, being talked about at the gas station the way Ruth used to talk about other families' troubles when I was a kid. Perhaps the part that seemed to bother him most, based on the one long conversation we had after all of it finally settled, wasn't the money at all. It was the ability to ever quietly explain this away to anyone in the family who still believed the best about him. I drove back to Birch Lake that night, alone, the way I had after Jason's first phone call months earlier, except this time the drive felt different. I remember pulling into the gravel driveway well past midnight, the cabin dark and quiet the way it had been that very first night, and sitting in the car for a long while before going inside, letting the whole shape of what had just happened settle over me, the way my mother used to let silence settle over a room before she'd finally speak. I spent the following year restoring the cabin. Same porch, same fireplace, same cedar dock, repaired rather than replaced wherever the wood could still be saved. I turned it into a small nonprofit, the Carol Lawson Shoreline Preserve, where local schools now bring kids for field days to study the lake, The way my mother used to quietly teach me the names of every bird on that water without ever calling it a lesson. The first field trip was a fourth-grade class from the same elementary school Jason, and I both attended 40 kids in rubber boots learning to identify pond insects off the end of that dock, while a retired biology teacher I'd hired part-time walked them through what made the shoreline worth protecting in the first place. I stood at the top of the yard with coffee going cold in my hands and thought about how many mornings she'd stood in almost that exact spot, watching a much smaller version of the same scene, never once explaining what she was quietly building toward. Ruth Hendricks comes by most Sundays now, the way she used to when my mother was alive, and sits on the porch with a cup of tea while the kids' laughter drifts up from the water. She told me once, watching a group of them crouched over the shoreline with nets and jars, that it was the first time in years the dock had sounded the way it used to when my mother was still the one keeping it standing. I didn't have a response for that. I just sat with her a while, the way my mother would have. I found one more journal during the renovation, ink faded but legible, and inside it the sentence Walter had already told me about. If it ever comes down to it, Emma will know what the land is actually worth, even if Jason only ever sees the number. I had that line, and the other one, the one she said to him at every Thanksgiving argument, framed above the fireplace, where every child who walks through for a field trip can read it before they head down to the water. Some places are worth more than money. Jason and I talk sometimes now, carefully. Not enemies. Not quite family in the way we used to be either, something quieter I haven't found the right word for yet. He's rebuilding in a smaller apartment, in a smaller city, doing work that pays considerably less than what he used to make, and from what I can tell, considerably more honestly. He asked me once, on one of those careful calls, whether I thought our mother would ever have forgiven him. I told him the truth, that I didn't know, and that it probably mattered less than whether he ever forgave himself for needing to ask. I stood on that dock the evening the preserve opened, watching the water turn from silver back to black, and thought about her sitting exactly where I was standing, wrapped in that same wool blanket, letting the silence sit the way she always did. I think she knew, long before either of us did, exactly what this place was going to be worth to me. Not in dollars, in everything else. If you were in my place, would you have saved the cabin, or saved your brother? Tell us in the comments.